Hello. Just want to give you some things to think about and discuss in your life groups this week after the talk that I brought on Sunday. So just a quick recap of what I covered. I was looking at the whole area of the Holy Spirit. We looked at Acts chapter 2. You might want to read that together now from verse 1 to the end, just to refresh your memories on that. And then we basically looked at 4 different areas. So the first thing was about how we are now temples of the Holy Spirit. We looked at how the tongues of fire being on the disciples' head and the rushing wind kind of indicating that God was identifying a new temple, not a temple made out of bricks and stone like in the Temple of Solomon or a tent, the tabernacle of Moses, but God was making people a temple. And so now we are temples of the Holy Spirit, and we get to carry the presence of God with us everywhere that we go. The second thing we looked at was about the power of the Holy Spirit and how Jesus had promised them that they would receive power when the Spirit came upon them. And we looked at all the things that happened as a result of them being filled. They spoke in different tongues, and those visitors who were visiting for that harvest festival of Pentecost were amazed because they could understand what these disciples were saying in their own languages. We looked at how they started acting completely different. They healed the sick, performed signs and wonders, they preached the gospel with authority, endured suffering, hardship, and displayed more of the fruit of the Spirit in their life as well. And basically the Holy Spirit transformed them and empowered them to become more like Jesus in terms of character and nature, and God shaping our desires, but also He empowered them to do the things that Jesus did in terms of activity and ministry. They were transformed inside and out. And the third thing we looked at was the gifts of the Spirit. And these are found in 1 Corinthians 12. And how it says that to each one the spiritual gifts are given. It doesn't say it's just for leaders or for the super spiritual. Everyone can receive these gifts, and these gifts are for the edification of the church, to build one another up, to encourage each other. They bring direction and wisdom, and they're also demonstrations of God's power to us and to unbelievers as well. And then the fourth and final area we looked at was that Jesus promised in John 14 that whoever believes in me will do the works that I have been doing. And we said how that meant not necessarily the quality of miracle, but it was talking about the quantity, because there were more of the disciples and they were more and more being added to them every day. As they did the works of Jesus, they were greater in quantity. And the whole of the book of Acts is bursting with miracles and signs and wonders. We talked about how people came to faith through both hearing the gospel, but also through experiencing the Spirit. It was both word and spirit. So that kind of covers what I discussed. The final thing I sort of challenged us on was if we are temples of the Holy Spirit and we can have what the Christians had, the early Christians had, the early church, the disciples were moving in, then should we settle for anything less than what they were moving in? And I suggested a few reasons why sometimes we settle for less than what they had. I talked about comfort and fear, and also disappointments in why we don't move and step out in faith in these areas. So that's a recap. Perhaps in your groups, they're not questions as such, but more discussion points. So why don't you talk about your own experiences of the Holy Spirit? Have you been filled with the Holy Spirit? What happened? What was the results? Did things change? Why don't you take a moment to share some stories with one another? And then secondly, it'd be great to discuss spiritual gifts in a lot more detail. I didn't have time for that on Sunday, but why don't you open 1 Corinthians 12, read that passage again, and perhaps talk about if there are some of those gifts you not quite understand, or you want to kind of discuss more as a group. Why don't you do that? And then it'd be great to discuss what gifts you have. Do you have any gifts of the Spirit? What's your experience of using them? What gifts are you wanting to grow in? And how could you support one another to grow in these in our life groups and in our church? And then lastly, why don't you again talk about how you're becoming more like Jesus in terms of sanctification? Are there particular areas of your life that God's really working on you or challenging you at the moment, and how he wants you to change to become more Christ-like? You might want to break down into smaller groups to do that, if it's more personal. And then think about the activity and the ministry of the Spirit. So what has God called you to? What are you passionate about? What activity are you doing to spread the gospel, to step out in spiritual gifts, in terms of, loving the poor, healing, generosity? What has God called you to do, and how are you doing the works of Jesus, and how can we grow in that together? Hope you have a good discussion, and have a great night.